This kidnapping claim, I think, has come up lately in the heat of the moment. Elian was living with his mother and stepfather in Cuba, not with his natural father. And I do feel sorry for his natural father. He's also suffered a loss. But the issues about what to do with a child in these circumstances have to be settled according to our law and according to common sense, only according to the best interests of the child. And the best interests of Elian are to stay here with a loving family in America and not be sent back to communist Cuba.
The father of a 5-year-old Cuban boy says his son should be moved back to his native country, but relatives in Miami are fighting for the boy to stay in America. Dan, I said I'd give you a chance to respond. Please go ahead.
Just very briefly, I think the question of the relationship with the father and whether the best interest would be served by him being with his natural father, those are factual questions that will come out eventually. There are two main culprits for creating the situation. One's Castro, obviously with his inferior material culture and the fact that he's an abject failure as a political leader, despite the fact that he's been there 40 years. But the second culprit is the Miami Cuban community that will not allow the people coming from Cuba to be handled the same way people from everywhere else around the world are, in an orderly way adjudicating refugee claims, by making it possible for everyone who gets here to stay here. They have created this smuggler's paradise, and that's apparently what his stepfather and mother were involved in, that encouraged people to make these kinds of trips in the first place.
Alex, is that a fair characterization of the relationship that we have with Cuba now? I know that there was a law signed by President Clinton a few years ago regarding a relationship that we have with immigration with Clinton.
There was a dramatic shift in American-Cuban immigration policy about 4 years ago. From the 1960s on, basically any Cuban who came to the United States was welcomed, and a year later were given a green card under the Cuban Adjustment Act. But in a set of negotiations between the United States and Cuba, an agreement was reached that permitted the United States to return Cubans directly who had been encountered on the high seas. Remember, this followed the dramatic boat flow that came out of Cuba about 4 summers ago, which led to unsafe voyages and people losing their lives, as we saw in the most recent situation. So the United States now has worked out an arrangement with Cuba where it can return people picked up on the high seas directly to Cuba. But for someone who comes to the United States, it needn't return them.
Linda, one of the arguments, I think the strongest argument that the father puts forth is, look, I'm this boy's father. I had a good relationship with him in Cuba. You may not like Cuba, but I do, and I want to raise my son this way. How do you counter something like that?
I say that's a valid point if it's true. I don't believe that it's true. And that is the factual assessment that needs to be made, and it cannot be made while the father is in Cuba.
But let me...
You can't discount the bond with the father and the child, and I'm not doing that.
I mean, let me give you a couple of fact situations. Suppose a mother was driving her son from California to Nevada and had an automobile accident. The child would automatically be returned to the father. Wouldn't that be true?
That would most probably be true. We're dealing with Cuba. The United States normally adjudicates these issues in a very civilized system under the Hague Convention of Child Abduction. Under that body of law, there is a systematic approach to handling these cases, and the child does not always return home. Again, we're focusing on the best interests of the child. Obviously, Cuba is not a signatory of the Hague Convention. There's not an orderly processing. But in using the Hague Convention as a guide, we need to assess the best interests of the child, and we don't know that.
Dan, it would seem to me that the focus here has shifted a little bit. It's not necessarily that, according to what Linda's saying, it's not necessarily that there's a better life in America, but is there a bad life in Cuba? And I suppose then that all that would have to be shown is, look, this is a good life in Cuba.
You're right. I mean, the only argument that's being made that I've heard about the best interest of the child have been that he will enjoy a superior material position in this country, better opportunity, obviously greater political freedom. But that's true for everybody in Cuba. That's true for about 2 billion people on the planet. So the question is, are we using this child's unique and very tragic situation to try to score a bunch of political points in geopolitical terms about our disapproval with Fidel Castro in Cuba, or are we looking dispassionately at the best interest of this child and his relationship with his natural father?
I want to give you a chance to respond, Linda.
No, that's not the only issue. Clearly, the United States is the land of opportunity, but the child's best interest may or may not be with the father, and it may not be the father's wishes for him to return to Cuba.
And there's a simple way to figure that out. If you let the father come through parole and allow him to decide to take the child back or not from Miami, you will have determined whether or not his actions are volitional and are without coercion. But you can do that. You could do that in the next week and resolve that issue one way or the other. But the broader question is, how do we prevent these sorts of situations from recurring? How do we discourage alien smuggling? How do we reinstitute orderly departure? And how do we put Cubans back on the same level legal playing field as everyone else on the planet, so we don't encourage this kind of chaos between here and Cuba?
Alex, I got to take a break, and let me just take this break. When I come back, more on this impossible subject. Stay with us. Well, Alex, before we left, I said I'd come right back to you. Your comments.
Thanks. I think I heard both Linda and Dan agree that it might be a good idea for the father to come to the United States and to testify in whatever state court proceeding would make a custody decision, which would be a matter of state law, not a federal law. That could be accomplished easily under the immigration law. Someone can be brought for a temporary purpose to attend a court proceeding. But the other point I wanted to make is, it seems to me that, we have a real human tragedy here. This is a kid who floated at sea after losing his mother and his stepfather at sea. And in some ways, the last thing the kid needs is a lawyer at this point. The kid may need all sorts of other kind of help and care. And I hear on both sides here a raising up of the rhetoric in geopolitical terms that I think in some ways loses sight of the underlying issue for the child.
It's a good point. In some ways, isn't this battle, haven't we lost what this battle is really all about? And isn't this now a battle between competing political situations, competing politics?
Well, I think it really shouldn't be. I think it ought to be decided on the best interests of the child with the political rhetoric laid aside on both sides.
Linda, if this was taken before a court, could you ever imagine a court in Florida saying, you know, I've listened to the arguments and I think this boy should return back to Cuba?
I don't see that happening because I don't think that that's the best interest for the child.
So in a way, it's almost rigged that the father could never win if he comes to Florida and has this hearing.
Rigged? I think that the facts surrounding the Castro regime would rig the conclusion, and perhaps that's also the father's real desire. We don't know that fact.
Is that the kind of decision that should be made, the facts surrounding the Castro regime? Is that what's the best interest for the child?
It's hard to believe that in this day and age anyone could say that unequivocally with the facts we know now. I mean, I'm a father. I mean, if my daughter wound up going to Canada without my knowledge at 3.5 years old and had a legal guardian appointed for her to make a political asylum claim, and I was never to see her again, I mean, what would that mean to me as a father for my daughter? I think it's the incredible hubris to say that this international geopolitical conflict should supersede the rights of a natural father to his son, and how we can adjudicate this thing without the clamor and glare of the Miami Cuban community's noisy approach, taking this kid and making him a poster boy, taking his picture to the WTO convention. I mean, we're talking about a child in a tragic situation he did not create. His mother and stepfather were smuggling aliens for $1,000 a head, and we're acting like this is some kind of political battle. This is a human tragedy.
Linda,
the Miami community has firsthand knowledge of Castro's oppression. We have to focus this case on the child, on the father, and the family in Miami. We don't know what the best interests are, and we won't know that until the father is here to resolve those questions.
That's a good concession from you. I think that's good. That's good. Well, it's good that we have a concession, because in the end,
but you're using this as a political sounding board when we need to get back into the facts of the son.
Right.
And not use...
But Linda, is the oppression, as we describe Castro's politics, is that really what we're talking about, or isn't it really should be whether or not he has a happy life with his father?
Whether the best interest, we don't know what the facts are. We don't know the father's true desires. I'm not talking about his life in Cuba, growing up with his father, who seems like a loving father by his statements. We don't know what those facts are. We have to flesh them out. And it's whether the father really has that subjective intent. And through history, you know, the Peter Pan Project, many parents would rather that their child have a better life and have a future for himself instead of living in the oppression of Castro. So yes, many families do, tragically, and I don't know personally if I would be able to do it or any of you would be able to do it, but many families want their children to have a better life for themselves, and they have that here in Miami and in the United States.
This is what's wrong with this case.
I'm afraid we're out of time, so I'm going to have to cut you off because that's all the time we have today. Thanks to our guests, and thank you for watching.